He came back, he said, like, I've had 6, 7 unsuccessful blood draws every time that I go to the hospital. Is it not possible to improve this procedure with technology? At some point in time, there was just a fight in the waiting room because all of them wanted to participate in the trial. They reached out to us saying like, hey, your guys are developing technology and we really need this technology. Typically, it's the other way around.
Getting your blood drawn is one of those things that most people quietly dread. You look away, you wince, and if the phlebotomist misses on the first try, you start to wonder, why is this still done the exact same way it was 50 years ago? Now, imagine a machine that finds your vein and draws your blood with no human hands involved. You might expect patients to be nervous about that. But when Toon Overbeeke's company ran clinical trials on exactly that device, patients in the waiting room weren't even hesitant. They were fighting to go first. Toon is the co-founder and CEO of Vitestro, which is building the world's first autonomous blood drawing device. And his pathway to get here, from management consulting to a solo motorcycle ride halfway across the world, is as unconventional as the technology itself. So you've had such an interesting journey to what you are doing now, and I'd love to go way back. I'd love to know when you first started to go to school as an engineer. What was your thinking about where your life would head?
I loved engineering. Before I made the decision to go into engineering, I thought, should I study business or economics or engineering? But at some point I figured, well, I can always go back from engineering to business, but the other way around is obviously more difficult. And I just liked mathematics and physics. So that was the reason to decide to go for engineering. When I started my mechanical engineering education, so I did my bachelor's and my master's, I really liked it. But once I started to study, I knew I won't be an engineer in the future. So it was not my goal to be an engineer itself because, well, I think engineering is great, but projects typically take a very long time. And I really wanted to learn quickly, see more things. So I wanted to be an entrepreneur at some point to, well, be involved in both that business and economic parts, but also while working on innovation, technology, and engineering. So I think it's a great combination of those different majors.
And is that what took you to your next stop working at Bain?
So, well, I wanted to learn something first before becoming an entrepreneur. And maybe also good to tell, I met my co-founder when I was a student. He at the time had a company that was a successful software company, which eventually got acquired by a large American multinational. And we basically worked on that transaction together. We worked very closely together. He was already an entrepreneur. And I thought I really want to be an entrepreneur myself at some point as well. And that was the reason for me to join Bain. Bain, because they do a lot of private equity, and it's very fast projects, doing mainly commercial due diligence, couple of weeks, and every couple of weeks you see another business, which was for me a great opportunity to learn, see several industries, to understand like what I'm looking for, where I'm gonna start my own business. So that was for me one of the reasons to join Bain. But I already knew once I joined Bain that I wanted to start my own business at some point. I want to be an entrepreneur. So the question was more like when instead of like if I wanted to be that. So that was basically after 3 years when I joined Bain that I started Vitestro.
And for our audience who isn't familiar with Bain, Bain is a large management consulting company. Is that right?
Yes, it is. Like many people know, McKinsey and BCG, and Bain is one of their largest competitors. Yes.
So you've trained as an engineer. You're working at Bain, but you're already thinking that you'd like to be an entrepreneur at some point down the line. Tell me a little bit more about what you were doing at Bain and what you enjoyed about what you're doing.
Yeah, so what I really liked about Bain is the culture that you're working in. It's one of the examples, I think, of like a culture with very driven, ambitious people that really want to do everything for the client. They all work like 70, 80 hours a week trying to work on the same goal, seeing a lot of different projects. Everyone is super smart. So I think that's a huge advantage of Bain. That's what I really liked. So it was a great culture to start in and great work ethics. And some people are using that work ethics to be successful in a more corporate journey. Well, I liked it there. That said, like, what is difficult from Bain, for me at least, is that you know quite far in advance where you are in like 3 years, 5 years, or 8 years time, because you know, well, in 10 years after I start, if everything goes well, you will be partner, and in 3 years you will be manager, and etc. So it's a very paved path, and I was a little bit more like I would say, a risk taker in that sense. So to me, like, it felt, if I already know what my life is going to look like in 5 to 10 years from now, that's not something that I'm going to enjoy. That was actually the reason also of eventually leaving Bain. Everyone gets the opportunity to do an MBA. I could have picked an MBA, but then, well, you're basically stuck for another like 4 years or so, doing a 2-year MBA and then like a earnout. So I decided to do something completely different, and I decided to grab a motorcycle and drive to the other side of the world. So the longest distance you can drive over land is basically from, well, Western Europe to Southeast Asia, and I decided to take on that adventure.
You know, as a trauma surgeon, when I hear risk taker, riding a motorcycle halfway across the world feels like pretty high up on the potential risk you can take. You know, Toon, this is so interesting because I think the work environment that you were describing even before you took that adventure must have been so mentally stimulating for someone like you who was so driven, had such big goals, to work around so many folks whose work ethic is at the absolute peak. Must not have been easy to step away from. And so to me, that shows me that you were even more driven about what you had coming next.
Yeah, and once again, so they are super driven, and it's a great company to work for, but it's quite a paved path, you know, a paved path to success, but still it's a paved path, and that's something that I missed basically. And going on this motorcycle journey, I really realized that, and it's a very different adventure, right? Because from intellectual standpoint, it's not necessarily the biggest adventure, but from a experience standpoint, it is. Basically, I crossed 30 different countries, 30,000 kilometers. Like these days, this trip wouldn't even be possible because I drove through to Iran, I drove through Pakistan. These days, it's not possible, right, to drive through these countries. It was definitely not without risk at the time that I did it, but it was at least better than it is today.
So you get in your motorcycle in Amsterdam, and 6 months later, you land in Bangkok, or you arrive in Bangkok, and you have all these incredible adventures along the way. Tell me about your mental journey. I'm so curious what that evolution was about you thinking about your life and your career and what you might be doing next along the way.
Yeah, so the first couple of weeks is, well, you need to get used to a very different routine than you're used to, right? So you really have to disconnect. And so the first 3 weeks I drove through Europe to Istanbul, and that's still like very similar to, well, it's all very similar, right? It's still highways. And then once you pass Turkey, it's mainly dirt road or there's some paved paths, but it's definitely not highway. So then it changes completely the environment and also the culture. And then once you cross Iran, so going to the Middle East, it's completely different. Former Soviet countries where I went through, Iran, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, then you're so in such a different like landscape, culture, difficult to communicate with people. And that's where I really disconnected because then you're in such a different environment and you can really start thinking about what do I want next. And I realized I was really enjoying the trip, and typically I'm not somebody that is doing a lot of things on my own. I'm really a team player. I love to work with people. I cannot be a night alone in my home. I need people around me, or I invite friends. So this was like really outside of my comfort zone to do something like this. I'm definitely not an introvert. So this was something to me that was a completely new experience. Well, some people obviously before I started the trip said it's nothing for you. Like you're not going to enjoy it because you're often by yourself, right? But it's surprising like how many amazing people there are on the world. I've basically, if I wanted, I just stayed with at people's home. They invited me for dinner, even where we couldn't speak, right? So limited amount of English that they were able to. They could barely speak English. It was just amazing to see that even with gestures, you get pretty far along, and maybe the conversation doesn't take like hours, but it takes at least a couple of hours. It's a great experience to have, and that also realized me, like, if you can drive to the other side of the world, you probably can also start your own business.
Wow. What a masterclass that must have been, even just at communication, even nonverbal communication when the verbal isn't really on the table. Must have been incredible.
Yes, it was, and in many of those countries, well, former Soviet countries, they didn't want people to speak English because well, it would give them the opportunity to leave. So, especially the people from age 30 and older, they have never learned English, right? So, it's it's great to see that the younger generation starts to learn English much better. But it was it was a major trip for sure.
Wow. And when I think about the kind of movie of your life that's been playing out here, to me, the next major point seems to be almost immediately when you get back. And I'm hoping maybe you can kind of take me there with you, what that was like, and the moment that gave you the inspiration for what you're doing now.
Yeah, so before I went on the trip, I thought, well, I might come back to Bain, but probably not. But let's decide that during the trip, and that was, I also communicated that very transparently to Bain. So I went on the trip, and then at some point in time, I remember me sending an email to Bain, like resigning for after my trip, like, guys, thank you so much, but I won't return. So basically, when I came back, which was December 2016. From January 2017 onwards, I basically founded Vitestro together with my co-founder, or at least like we started to develop the idea of autonomous robotic phlebotomy. Already before my trip, a good friend of mine, his father was diagnosed with cancer. He had chemotherapy, and it was very difficult to draw blood from his veins because his veins were, well, very bad because of the chemo. He came back, he said, like, I've had 6, 7 unsuccessful blood draws every time that I go to the hospital. Is it not possible to improve this procedure with technology? So that was basically where the question came from. And well, we started to talk to a lot of labs and hospitals to understand, do they really need such an innovation? And they actually became very excited about the idea. So we basically came to them with nothing, right? We had just a PowerPoint slide. That was it. And still they got excited about the idea, and they said, well, for us, we have like 2 main problems. So first of all, there's just a shortage on labor. It's difficult to get the right people to perform the blood draws. And then secondly, standardization is important because the lab has gone through, well, it's really transformed over the last 30 years. So 30 years ago, all the analysis were done manually, whereas today there's a lot of analyzers from Siemens, Roche, BD, where the sample just goes on a track autonomously from one analyzer to the other analyzer. So it's completely automated. It reduced the amount of errors significantly, and the only manual step in the whole process of analyzing blood is taking the blood. So the start, it's called the pre-analytics. We decided, okay, this is really something that is very important to the labs because they're so used to automation these days. What I didn't know before I started the business is that the quality of blood depends highly on how you draw blood. For example, and you probably know that with your background, but hemolysis can occur when drawing your blood, which means that the red blood cells can rupture, and therefore it gets really difficult to analyze the blood. But once you do it right, the blood drawing, well, there's basically no hemolysis. So by standardizing the procedure, it's a huge opportunity to reduce hemolysis rates as well, which is important for patient treatment, throughput, and well, especially for patients on, well, also emergency settings, for example, you see quite high hemolysis rates because there are phlebotomists that are not very experienced there, and that's something that we can solve. So it's a very important device to maintain the quality of care and improve quality of care, but also patient experience.
You know, it's so interesting, the insight about hemolysis, and I'll just add in there, sometimes it's not even obvious that blood has been hemolyzed until you're looking at the results, and the numbers seem really surprising. And for instance, the potassium might seem very high. So then, in addition to having a hemolyzed sample, you have this period of time where you don't know if it's hemolyzed or not, and so you don't know if the results that you're looking at are accurate or not. And what an interesting insight for you to come across early. You've also spoken about the original I wouldn't even say vision at this point, but the original thinking about what you were looking to build in terms of the technology behind something that could reliably have a high fidelity of blood drawing, and then the process of deciding to make this an automated platform. How did you get there? Was it purely what you're talking about just now with seeing that the lab has so much automation built in, or?
Well, I think the idea started really from a problem, and what you see these days very often is that there's an invention, for example, at an academic center, and they want to commercialize that invention, and then sometimes they need to find the problem with the solution, right? They have an innovation, and they need to find where's this a solution for, basically. Well, our approach was completely different. We identified a problem with a patient that we wanted to solve, and I realized already early on that identifying a problem for a patient is not sufficient to build a business, right? Because it also needs to be a problem for your customer. There's a lot of problems for patients which will never get solved because from an economical standpoint, it doesn't make sense to solve that because it's, for example, for a very small population, it's very difficult to raise money, for example, for such an innovation with a very small addressable market. And this is just a huge problem because blood drawing and venipunctures, it's the most commonly performed invasive procedure in the world. After some research, there's about, on average, 2 to 3 blood draws per capita in the world, especially in the Western countries. So in the US, it's over 1 billion blood draws that are done yearly, and it's outpatient. So it's massive, right? The volume. So we really had this vision to bring this device to the patient and like ideally for every patient everywhere. And that's still the vision. We focused primarily now on the outpatient phlebotomy department. And then especially the high volume centers, because then, well, you have a high utilization rate of your device, and then basically your cost per blood draw drops, right? If you use it 40 or 50 times a day versus 10, you can imagine that your cost per blood draw will drop. So that's the main focus. And then, well, in the future, I see like a miniaturized version or something of the system where we can also address like inpatient population or more decentralized locations where the product would also work very well. So the vision is like much broader than what we're doing today. And today we're really focusing on the outpatient setting, but there's so much integration still possible and additional automation with the existing product. The market is just massive.
And so what I'm hearing from you, tell me if this is right, is that by introducing automation, it gives you more opportunity to make a broader impact on this full large population. Is that where the thinking was?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think going after this problem, well, one of it, I really wanted to build a product because a service is not really scalable. A product is. That's the reason why we wanted to build a product. And I think what's the great thing about this device is that it sees so many patients.
I feel like we're getting a little closer to the technology. One thing that I find so interesting is the human psychology that you've spoken publicly about flowing into the design, even down to the way the different movements happen in a way to build trust in patients. I think that is so interesting. Could you share a little bit more about that and what that was like and how you got to those realizations?
When we started the business, we basically asked ourselves 3 questions where we needed to have an answer on. The first one, and probably the most important one, is are patients going to adopt this technology? Because eventually, if patients don't want to use the device, the business will not succeed. The second one was very obvious: can we find the vein? And the third one was: if we find the vein, can we draw blood from the vein? So that's basically the 3 main questions that we are asking ourselves. The last 2 questions are very obvious. The first one probably is as well, if you think about it. So we spend a lot of time on the design of the device and also like patient responses, patient interaction. What we did in the early days, we built mock-ups, so without any technology inside, to really see what the patient's response is on the system. How can we make it look as friendly as possible? We did so many surveys to understand what is going to drive patient adoption, which patients will adopt the technology earlier than other patients, and why is that? Well, what was very interesting to us, something we didn't expect up front, is that if you ask a question like, would you like to get a blood draw from a robotic system or from a device, which sounds more friendly than a robotic system, in a setting where it's not in a hospital. So, for example, you're drinking a beer at a birthday party. People are much more negative than when you ask the same question in a hospital setting. And it kind of makes sense, right? Because you're in a different setting, but still, like it's so different. The amount of patients that say yes, and we figured a couple of things. So first of all, if a supervisor or a nurse with a white coat walks up to you and asks you, "Hey, would you like to use a system today or a device to get your blood drawn?" It's so different than you're on a birthday party and a friend of you tells it like with a smile, like, "Hey, do you want to use a system to get your blood drawn?" Right? It's a completely different experience. And when you think about it, how often have you been treated in the hospital and you need to use a device, no matter what it is, like MRI, CT scan, or whatever, and you're questioning whether this device is going to work? Like, probably not, right? If the nurse says, "Hey, you need to use this device, we're going to use it," and for example, in an MRI, and you need to lie still for half an hour, you just accept it, right? There's not that you're going to debate, like, is the device going to work? You just assume it is working. And that's the same thing that we saw. So with our system, so once we were doing clinical trials, like the acceptance rate of people was sky high. Something that we initially thought, well, I'm not sure how many patients will join this clinical trial, but we were allowed to recruit on the spot during that trial. And at some point in time, there was a long waiting line, probably about like 30 minutes, 40 minutes. And we just went randomly to people in the waiting room, asking them if they would like to join our clinical trial. And if they said yes, they were allowed to join like immediately, so they could skip the line. And at some point in time, there was just a fight in the waiting room because all of them wanted to participate in the trial because they could go first and they could skip the line. This shows an example like where you're on a birthday party and people are like concerned about, is this device going to be used? And then there's like a fight in a waiting room because people want to join a clinical trial. So not even a commercial device, a clinical trial with a system that is for clinical investigation. And that shows like that people are very willing to use the system and maybe even more willing to use the system once there is a longer waiting line. So I think that's one of the great insights that we had. Another one that we had is that we have done blood draws with over 10,000 patients today. So a very large sample size for a medical device for trials. And what we found out very interestingly is that if you ask patients, like, are you also after procedure and before procedure, if they would like to participate, if you were to ask me this question before doing the trials and you ask, like, are there any differences between acceptance rates between like younger and older patients? My assumption would be younger patients who are more innovative are more willing to use the system. And it turns out that elderly are more likely to use the system than younger people are. We try to understand, like, why is this the case? Because it sounds so counterintuitive. They're not necessarily the innovators in this world. Well, the median age of our population in our trials is about 65 years old. So 50% of the patients are older than 65 years. They are so used to blood drawing. So first of all, there's a lot of experience, years of experience. Some of them, 60% of the patients return 4 or more times per year to the outpatient center to get their blood drawn. Some of them even come back every week, so 50 times a year. They're so used to blood drawing that they first of all know the variability of the phlebotomist. So there are some that are very, very good and very skilled in drawing your blood, whereas others are not necessarily. So they know the variability. And secondly, there's no anxiety anymore. If you get so many blood draws, then there's no anxiety anymore for a needle. So you're used to a needle in your arm, or at least it's not a pleasant experience, but at least you're used to it, right? You're not afraid anymore. So that's the difference between the elderly and the younger population, because if somebody's like in their 20s, it might be even their first blood draw. And then doing that first blood draw with a system might create more anxiety than for elderly. This is one of the concerns up front, because your population consists of mainly elderly, because they go for blood draw more frequently than younger people. But actually, for us, it turns out pretty well, because that's the target population of our system.
Toon, I'm wondering if we could take a couple minutes to talk about the tech that's happening behind the scenes with the vision for the machine to be able to see the contrast of where the vein is, the ultrasound being able to map where it is, because it is so fascinating how precise this Aletta system is able to be. And I'm so curious how that all comes together.
Yeah, so what we're using, we're using a combination of infrared and ultrasound. First, infrared is used to determine where the vein is located in the arm, like approximately. And then once we have identified the vein, we can position the ultrasound on top of the arm to see the vein. And then based on the ultrasound image, we can determine the optimal location for needle insertion. So we're using both a combination of infrared and ultrasound, but we don't make any decisions of needle insertion on the infrared.
When you got to the point of designing different components of the system, I would love to hear about some of the design decisions that you made that were so attuned to human psychology and what it would feel like to be a patient using this machine.
Yeah, so we try to make the design so that, first of all, one size fits all is actually what you're trying to do, which is often difficult because there's so many different sizes of patients, of arms, of, you can imagine the P1 and the P99 of arms, for example. You have like those very tiny arms and those, quite big arms. So you need to be compatible with all of those. So that was one of the design challenges, but it was one of the requirements that we had up front. And also one of the design requirements was that you can use both your left or your right arm in the system. And then what was important to us is that we really take the patient along in their journey. So we explained step by step what's going to happen. And eventually, in the start, the system will be used with a supervisor. So one person will supervise 2 or 3, or maybe in the future, even more systems at the same time. So the supervisor cannot be always with the patient, but will be there at the start, because we believe that this human touch is critical. If you don't have the human touch with the system, that's not going to work. So the supervisor is basically there to put their hand on the shoulder of the patient and said, "Hey, you're all set. You can just press the start button." And then the patient is okay, and the supervisor can go to the next device while the blood has been will be taken from the patient on device number 1. So that's how we envision it and how we've tested it as well. And that seemed to work out pretty well, because at least the patient arrives at the system. There might be some anxiety, but then once somebody says, "Hey, you're all good," that's the point that the patient is much more relaxed and you can just go to the next one. That's definitely one of the important design requirements, next to the requirement to take the patient along in their journey. So we have 2 user interface on the system where patient can just see like, okay, what's next, what's happening right now, and basically when am I finished with the procedure. And then another very important design requirement was that the patient shouldn't see the needle. So we had tested before how many patients look at their arm when the needle goes in the arm with manual phlebotomy. And it turns out that that's a very small percentage that is willing to look at the needle going inside their arm. So we figured, like, if we can design the system so that patients don't see it, then that is going to really help and drive adoption. And I think, like, in hindsight, that was definitely the right choice, because the feedback that we get over and over again for patients is, "Oh, I'm so glad that I don't see the needle." And we explain them, "Hey, we're going to puncture you right now," so they know that the needle is coming, but they don't see it, and that's something that they really value. That's the feedback we get all over, every time. So yeah, I think those are definitely the next to safety, because safety is obviously I didn't mention safety, but safety is obviously critical for such a system, that no harm can occur to the patient, and we spend a lot of time on safety and all the control measures in place to make sure that the patient is always safe. And in those 10,000 blood draws, we haven't seen any moderate or large adverse events at all. Adverse event rate is significantly lower even than with manual phlebotomy. And all the events that we have seen are not device related, but procedure related. So safety profile has turned out to be very, very good.
I'd like to shift gears here for a second to talk about what the experience has been like in building this. And what I'm really, really curious about is, so often you hear of folks who are building something that's a really validated need. They found that there's a real sort of pain point at the market level for patients. And there's still this kind of hand-to-hand combat of going health system to health system, trying to get folks onboarded. And yet, in the Vitestro story, when I hear this story of patients fighting to to get to be part of your trial, to me that almost feels symbolic for so much of your journey. How when you've reached out to folks to see if they might be interested, there's almost a sense that they are coming out of the woodwork to find you for your product. And I'm curious if is that what the experience was like on your level?
Well, there's definitely a huge need for the system, so that for sure. And for example, we recently announced a round, Mayo Clinic being part of them, being part of that round. And initially, they reached out to us saying like, "Hey, your guys are developing in technology, and we really need this technology. Can we have a conversation?" So, I mean, typically it's the other way around that folks are approaching Mayo because they wanted to work together with Mayo, but it was exactly the other way around. And it's such a novel technology, and it doesn't exist these days. Especially the labs and the clinicians get so excited about it. So I guess what you're saying is true. Yes.
I recognize that you have a tiny bit of bias, as the CEO and the founder, and
Oh,
so
for sure.
not surprising that you have absolute conviction that this is a massive unmet need and a market that so dearly needs this technology. But I suspect you're not alone with technology founders who feel that way about their product, and yet not everyone has customers coming out of the woodwork and coming to them. Were you surprised, or were you expecting that this is exactly what would happen when you reach this point in the journey?
It's a good question, and it's always a hard question to answer because you only have a sample size of one, right? So at least in my case, because it's just Vitestro that I can basically use as reference, and not like other companies that I've been in the same position with. But I guess it's something that you hope for, and what we have done before we started the company very thoroughly is to talk to many customers if there's really a need for this. Because if there was no need for that, I think that's what I mentioned earlier as well. We started the business because there was a problem, and we didn't start the business because we had a great technology that we wanted to commercialize. Well, we took a very thorough approach at the start. At the time, we didn't have so much experience with so many labs, and we didn't talk to so many KOLs as we did today. So that evolved over time. But it's very important that before you start a business that you really understand, is there really a problem that we're solving today, or is it a nice to have? And I think that's a question that we have successfully answered. You never know if there is a new innovation that makes yours outdated or whatever during the journey. I mean, there can always be surprises, but in our case, that's not that did not happen. It's something you hope for, and I think it turns out to be true.
Toon, you mentioned earlier in our discussion the vision that you described as every patient everywhere, and as you are at the point in your journey where you're really starting to hit, I guess, multiple inflection points. You just closed this massive Series B. Congratulations! When you started the company, what did success look like to you at that point in the journey, and what does it look like now?
Well, when you start off, you're as a founder, CEO, you're working towards like, okay, well, at the goal, you have this vision, but there are these milestones in between which you need to hit those value inflection points before you can move on. The first one is, okay, I want to have a prototype. Then the next one is, okay, I want to do the first in human. Then once you've done the first in human, you really want to do more trials. You want to create this evidence that this device is working clinically. Well, now we have done over 10,000 blood draws. And then it's like, okay, now we're going to commercialize. Then, okay, well, we have some customers in Europe. We now want to get customers in the US. Okay, let's hire people in the US. And then you go to the US. So that's what we have done so far. And what I realize is there's always something next. We closed 2 weeks ago, we closed this $70 million Series B. And I was sitting at home, and we announced it. Well, as a founder, you're also solving a lot of problems because that's your job, right, as a CEO. And then I was working late, and my wife was sitting next to me, and she said, "Did you actually enjoy it?" And if you were to ask me 5 years ago, hey, Toon, you're going to raise in 5 years from now, you're going to raise a $70 million round, I would be like, wow, that's amazing, right? But then once I did it and I was working late during the day that we announced it, and my wife asked that question, like, did you really enjoy it? I was like, well, 5 years ago, I would definitely said that I would enjoy it. And now I'm basically on the same day, I'm solving another problem. And so what does success look like? Back to your question, it's continuously changing. And I also realized that with a great colleague of mine, he always says, like, it's a Jeff Bezos saying, but it's always day one. And that's sometimes how it feels, right? Because it's day one again. And yes, you hit a milestone, but you really you should enjoy it. But you're working on the next already, you know? Yeah, success is changing over time. And it's always gets larger, basically. You always want to go further. You want to reach more. You want to get better at stuff. Yeah.
Toon, as you look back on the version of you less than 10 years ago who was just getting back from this adventure on a motorcycle and had a fire in your heart to build something but hadn't yet even found your idea, what advice would you give that person who really wants to build something but doesn't know where to start?
I think it's important to have, well, first of all, perseverance. It's not always easy. Dedication, because it takes a lot of effort to build something up from scratch. And thirdly, I would say focus. You need to focus on making the business a success. There's a lot of distractions and great things you can do else than work. But if you want to succeed, I think perseverance, dedication, and focus is key to succeed.
Well, Toon, thank you so much for talking with me today. This has been such a special experience getting to hear this whole journey.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to be here.